All right, guys, this is it. The last time you have to hear me talk. Today we're talking about your last chapter, Media, Power, and Political Communication. Of course, you have just finished your fourth quiz. Your essay is due on April 25th. You guys have had that for quite some time now. And your third and final exam will be posted next week, April 25th as well. And it will be due on the final day that I can grade things, because I have to submit grades on Monday, May 2nd. So that is all posted in Blackboard, but let me know at my Gmail, annalyrits@gmail.com, if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll dig in. You guys, I can't believe it's the end of the semester. All right, the media, power, and political communication. So the chapter, I always love to start out with kind of how your chapter gets into this, because it's so interesting to look at living in kind of an information bubble. The book starts out talking about in June 2016, there was a shooting in a nightclub called the Pulse nightclub. And there were these two different stories that emerged. There was one story that said there was this mentally disturbed shooter who's conflicted about his own sexuality. And he was interviewed by the FBI for terrorist sympathies, on the terrorist watch list, but he was still able to be a licensed security guard and buy an assault rifle. Hillary Clinton was running for president at the time. She really embraced the LGBT community, talked about an assault weapon ban, and these themes were really talked about and woven into a common story that were shared like wildfire. And then the other side of the story said the shooting was conducted by a member of ISIS who was committed to exterminating gays. Obama was the president at the time, and he was complicit, they said, by not using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism and for suspected Muslim sympathies. The big question was, how did he get in the country, and how can people like him be kept out? Donald Trump, who was also running for president at the time, expressed sympathy for the LGBT community, but reiterated his call on an immigration ban from countries where there was a perceived threat to Americans, which also took on wings with his base and on social media. These were two totally narratives from the same event, and if you lived in one world, you may not have ever even heard of the other narrative or known it even existed. It was this closed loop of self-reinforcing evidence that supported a particular interpretation of events. So, the essential function of communication is to record our events, to give meaning to them, to create a story or narrative about how they fit into the past and stretch into the future. People have done it for a long time. With legends and myths and holy texts, fairy tales, humans, we tell stories, guys. It gives us a history and a way of passing down history to new generations. Part of politics is having your narrative accepted as the authoritative, wow, I can't say that, authoritative account. Sorry. Storytellers of the past and power holders have a monopoly and have had a monopoly of control for a lot of human history, because people couldn't read. Books were in scarce supply. And so these people who could read and could tell stories were really powerful. Gatekeepers. These were journalists and media elite who determined which news stories were covered and which stories weren't. It's not so anymore. Everybody reads. We're in this constant explosion of narratives from TV news to Facebook. But where do you get your information? Narratives are built from information, and we get that from a wide array of media sources. Media, being the plural of medium, is an agency through which communication between two different entities takes place. When you think about a medium, maybe you think about somebody who claims to transmit messages from the spiritual world to earthbound souls. But today's mass media conveys information cheaply and efficiently from the upper reaches of politics to everyday citizens. Mass media, this is the means of conveying information to large public audiences cheaply and efficiently. Today, we do a lot more than just watch and listen to the media. We're more interactive than we used to be. Media convergence is the merging of traditional media with digital communication technologies such as telecommunications and the internet. Politicians have to stay on top of this, on top of electronic innovation that continually shapes and alters the political world. It's just as important for the media to help carry information back from the citizens to the politicians. News media really relies on technology, and all the innovations in media have been really developed in the last 200 years, and only in about the last 50 years have they been used commonly. News used to enter the average American's life at only a couple of neatly defined and very predictable points during the day. You read your local paper over breakfast. The afternoon paper waited for you when you came home from work. But big cities were expensive, and they came late unless you actually lived in the big city papers. In the 1960s, the evening news came on all 3 TV stations at 7:30. Walter Cronkite was the most trusted face in television news. Unless there was a special event like the space shoot or the tragedy like the JFK assassination required a special bulletin, you only got your news at those times. Today we get it all the time, everywhere. Today we get a little news from a lot of sources. Not many of us get it from newspapers or the radio. A lot of us get it from social media. Millennials are the most likely to rely on Facebook for news than their elders. Baby boomers rely on local television. Gen Xers kind of split the difference. So younger generations are more likely to get their news from sources they curate themselves. They choose their own source of news. Older Americans watch whatever is served up to them by the media elite. So we're exposed to a lot of news, but the levels of information that we actually acquire are not that high. Younger people have a harder time answering questions about domestic policies and public figures than older people. What about print media? Print media is in deep trouble. In 1941, about a third of Americans bought a daily paper. In 2009, only about 13% did. 2015 was the worst year for print media since the Great Recession, and it's probably gotten worse since then. Many papers have ceased publication and have moved to a print-online hybrid or simply online only. A lot of towns only have one paper if they have one at all. Journalism has traditionally been paid for by newspapers that either have their own news bureaus around the world or they subscribe to something called the Associated Press, the AP. And they pay these for sources that come from money that comes from advertisers who have no other way to reach out to their market. But now those advertisers have a lot of other outlets to reach customers. So it's hard to even find advertisers in this world. We don't know what journalism is going to look like in a new post-newspaper age. I was actually a journalism major in college, and it's changed even since I was in college. Radio and television. I was actually broadcast journalism. I thought I was going to be on TV. Radios were once state of the art. They're now really commonplace. A lot of Americans have more than one, and say most people listen to the radio weekly. In the 1980s, the talk radio came about, where it became kind of an interactive political platform where radio hosts and their guests could talk to the audience or air their opinions on politics to the nation. There are 2 non-commercial networks, National Public Radio, NPR, and Public Radio International. They've got a small stipend that is funded by the United States government, but they're mostly funded by private donations. But the impact of radio cannot even compare with the effects of television. In 1950, 9% of homes had a TV. By 1975, 97% of homes have a TV. Right now, we have probably more than one television in our home, maybe more than 3. And almost everybody has cable television. So live television viewership has declined, but we use other means. DVR, stream from internet. There's a company called Nielsen. It's a marketing firm that tracks audience share that says Americans watch 5 hours of TV a day. This doesn't count what we're doing on other devices. So we spend 6 to 8 hours a day at school or work, and then TV for 5 hours outside of that. That's a lot of time that Americans are spending watching television. TV is primarily entertainment. News has always been secondary, but now there's kind of a combination, infotainment or news shows dressed up with drama and emotion to entice viewers to tune in. We once had 3 television stations. Now we average about 189, but we generally watch about 17 of them. I don't watch 17 of them. I watch fewer than that. But stations really focus on specific audiences. This is called narrowcasting, targeting specialized audiences by the media. JFK was the first to make real use of TV. Like, it was designed for young, photogenic JFK. But TV really brought the country together in a community of grief when he was assassinated. Cable stations and C-SPAN, America's Town Hall, offer news around the clock, but not all news concerns politics. Political shows target age groups or ideologies, and sometimes we'll have politics be the subject of jokes, like on Saturday Night Live or The Daily Show. Since 2000, the major political candidates and their wives are running for president, tend to appear on these shows to show that they're likable, regular people, and to reach audiences that may not have otherwise tuned into politics. And then comes the internet. The reach of print, radio, and TV is really completely dwarfed by the scope and possibilities of the internet. In 2015, about 85% of Americans use the internet. 70% have broadband access at home, and that's something we're working on in Congress right now, is having everybody have access to broadband. most people are able to access internet from their smartphones or other devices. The internet has really revolutionized how we get information. It's made politics immediate and personal. For most of history, we haven't known our fellow citizens outside of our own communities, and we have not really been able to directly investigate issues themselves. We had no idea the actions our government was taking to deal with the issues unless the media told us. But now we can look this stuff up ourselves. We're still really dependent on the mass media to connect us to our government and to create the only real space we have for the public deliberation of issues. But technological developments make possible even newer forms of political community and more access to information. The government officials can communicate with us directly and bypass the traditional press. I mean, they can talk to us online. Visionaries of the day will talk of the day where we'll all vote electronically on individual issues from our home computers or phones. But even if we're not there yet, changes in the media are really revolutionizing. You guys, why am I talking like this? The politics and possibilities of democracy, just as much as the printing press and television have done in the past. News organizations are businesses, occasionally nonprofits, devoted to reporting and disseminating news via print, broadcast, or digital media, or a multimedia combination. Most of them are mostly multimedia ventures. We search for topics we want and connect to links with related sites. We kind of end up customizing our web news. We can bypass non-political news and vice versa, but true political junkies go straight to the source, and the federal government makes a lot available. You have like whitehouse.gov and then house.gov and senate.gov. And if you want to look at your member of Congress, you could look at like Joe Wilson's website would be wilson.house.gov. Some websites exist solely on the internet and may not adopt the convention's practices and standards of more conventional media, however. Then you have something called a news aggregator, which is a website application and software that culls content from other digital sources. These are things like Google News, HuffPost, BuzzFeed, The Skim, that choose articles from other sites to share with their readers. Sometimes they have original content, but it allows readers to customize their own feeds. These overlapping sources give us access to more information than ever before, but the task of sorting and evaluating that information is really our own responsibility. The web provides information, but it's also interactive to a degree that really surpasses talk radio and television. We must involve discussion opportunities where all sorts of information can be shared, debated, and people can meet. So political campaigns started taking advantage of this in 2008, and they used social media to organize, to raise funds, to get out the vote. Obama's campaign was super skillful at this. And the new media landscape is really fertile for positive changes. Citizen-driven journalism is taking the place of a complacent, rates-driven corporate journalism. Information gathered and disseminated in real time with multiple researchers on the job to correct and assist each other. There's no one experiment that's going to replace what we're now losing with the demise of a newspaper on paper. But over time, maybe these collections of new experiments might give us the journalism we need, or maybe not. What about media ownership? How does it control the narrative? The ownership or structure of American media has really changed a lot since our founding. Back then, newspapers were partisan instruments dependent on their government for existence. But today, most news comes from, or at least through, these giant corporate-owned sources. The media is big business on a scale undreamed of by such early journalism entrepreneurs like Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst, whose fiercely competitive tabloid wars gave birth to what's known as yellow journalism, as each rushed to attract readers with sensational headlines and stories. Traditional mainstream media still exists, but a single figure doesn't dominate a paper or a station's editorial policy, and it's no longer found only in its original or broadcast form. They all have huge digital presences. There are 6 corporations: Time Warner, which has merged with AT&T, Disney, Viacom, CBS Corporation, News Corporation Limited, and Comcast. And some of those might have even actually merged and changed names since then. But they own most of the major national newspapers, news magazines, TV networks, publishing houses, movie studios, telephone companies, entertainment firms, other multimedia operations, and most are involved in other businesses. We recognize their names. So editorial decisions are matters of corporate policy, not individual judgment, and profit is gospel. Some startups tend to be gobbled up by other outlets, and journalists who maybe began as a blogger become part of a bigger media picture. The media, of course, gets the bulk of its revenue from advertising rather than circulation, but advertisers go after the most popular media outlets, so competition's fierce. Social media is becoming a favored news source, but they're not news producers. They use their own formulas to decide what news to expose us to. Cell phone users customize news streams. Smartphone users are notable for heavy news consumption, but people who have news on mobile devices are spending longer with the news and getting it from more sources. This is my husband. He's constantly reading things on his phone, on different websites, CNN, Fox News, whatever he can see. He wants to read as many opinions as possible. So these readers but they're disproportionately well-educated and young, so America's news reading habits may be changing. And the web may be coming closer to realizing its potential for offering a truly democratic, practical land and a free alternative to the corporate-produced news that we now receive. But we need to be aware of some consequences, some different impacts on how media ownership impacts the news we get. The first being commercial bias. This is the tendency of the media to make coverage and programming decisions based on what will attract a large audience and maximize profits. People tune in to watch scandals and disasters. They're covered a lot. The second is the effort to get and keep a large audience to make way for the increased advertising. This is going to mean a reduced emphasis on political news, especially at the local level where older Americans get their news. The third is that the content of the news we get is lightened up, dramatized, and streamlined to keep audiences tuned in. Some specialize in infotainment, news dressed up to be engaging. And then clickbait. These are sensational headlines designed to tempt internet users to click through to a specific website. Fourth is corporate ownership of today's media means that media outlets frequently face conflicts of interest in deciding what news to cover or how to cover it. 33% of newspaper editors say they would not feel free to publish news that might harm their parent company, which should make us question what's being left out of the news we receive. And then fifth, breaking a news story has always been a point of pride for editors and journalists. Journalists have to walk a fine line between the time spent reporting and getting these stories published before the competition does, which becomes even more intense as the deadlines for print or nightly broadcasts have become even more intense and given way to this 24-hour news cycle. So many people want to avoid getting scooped. Sometimes they jump the gun and disseminate incorrect information or even flat out lies. The corporate media conglomerations don't define all of our alternatives for getting the news. I'm so sorry, I'm so tongue-tied today. The explosion of online publishing gives more alternatives for getting and sharing information that's not subject to a corporate agenda. Government-owned radio and television can provide an alternative for profit media. Americans tend to assume that the wholly owned or controlled by the government media serve the interests of the government rather than the citizens, but privately owned media are not necessarily free from advertiser influence. There are countries like the United Kingdom that have government-owned sources like the BBC that can be a bastion of creativity and innovation and also a well-respected gatekeeper. Almost all media is privately owned, but they don't operate without some public control. In the early days of radio, there was this great public enthusiasm for the new medium that resulted in so many radio stations that the signal interference threatened to damage the whole industry. So broadcasters asked the government to impose some sort of order. They passed the Federal Communications Act, which created the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, in 1934. And the FCC, this Federal Communications Act contained some provisions in it to ensure some fairness. They had an equal time rule. So if one candidate talks, they must give the others the same amount of time. Fairness doctrine, which required stations to give free airtime to issues of public concern, and the right of rebuttal. If somebody's reputation was damaged on air, they could respond. A lot of this has been limited or eliminated since then, but the rules remain controversial. A lot of them were abolished with the 1996 Telecommunications Act in order to open up competition and promote diversity in media markets. Some internet users would favor a policy of net neutrality that would ensure that telecommunications companies can't control their internet access or restrict or limit content with price discrimination and would keep the internet unfettered and open to innovation. Opponents argue that such a policy would reduce incentives for companies to innovate. In 2015, I've talked a little bit about net neutrality in the past, and I was working for the House Judiciary Committee at the time, so it was a really interesting thing to be watching. The Federal Communications Commission came out in 2015, had Obama's backing, and they ruled in favor of net neutrality, ensuring that all internet traffic must be treated equally. The ruling has no chance of becoming law, and the House Republicans voted to oppose it. It's been challenged in court. So who are the journalists? They are these gatekeepers who decide what news gets covered and how. Corporate ownership doesn't tell the whole story of modern journalism. The mass media is no longer primarily owned by individuals, and much of digital media is filtered through news aggregators that simply report to the linking of others. But individual journalists continue to be the eyes and ears and nose and legs of the business. They discover, they report, they edit, they publish the news in newspapers and magazines, on radio, on television, and the internet. So journalists play 4 roles, which often coexist in a single journalist. First is gatekeeper. They decide details about what gets covered or not and how. Not all journalists share this power equally. They're disseminators. They're reporters who combine their role to getting the facts of the story straight and moving the news out to the public quickly, avoiding stories with unverified content, reaching as wide of an audience as possible, open to the criticism that in a complex society, simple dissemination does nothing to help citizens understand the news. They are also interpreters or investigators. They develop their role in reaction to this criticism and to the growing sophistication of the issues confronting the American public. It combines the functions of investigating the government's claims and analyzing and interpreting complex problems, discussing public policies in a timely way. Investigative reporters are journalists who research and verify the truth of political or corporate narratives and claims. Muckrakers of the early 20th century who exposed social ills like child labor, and latter-day reporters like Woodward and Bernstein who exposed the Watergate cover-up. Then you have public mobilizers. They develop the cultural and intellectual interests of the public. They set the political agenda. They even let the people express their views. They're closely aligned with a contemporary movement called civic journalism, which is a movement among journalists to be responsive to citizen input in determining what news stories to cover. With the growing presence of the internet as a space where people can communicate and organize, public mobilization is becoming a more grassroots affair. So, who are journalists? They're still overwhelmingly white and male. Most mainstream media focuses on issues of concern to white middle-class America and the reflective values of that population at the expense of minorities. It's not the demographics by the ideologies of journalists that most are concerned with. It's typically the more educated people are more liberal, and so journalists tend to be more well-educated and lean a little bit to the left. They strive to leave their values outside the newsroom and do objective work, but there are studies that say there is no discernible bias in the media, but you know that's probably not true. Conservatives have made an effort to bring what they think is called balance to the news. Fox News, of course, Breitbart, the Wall Street Journal editorial page. But how do we spin a political narrative? The stories that we tell legitimize or delegitimize power. Think of the narrative that Northerners tell about the Civil War versus what we as Southerners tell. It was a war to end slavery and restore national unity, or a war of succession because states' rights were violated. Same war, different narrative. When Walter Cronkite visited Vietnam in 1968 and said we were losing the war, LBJ knew he had lost support from the country because of how trusted Cronkite was. We like to think of journalism and news gathering as all about facts, and if it's in its purest sense it is, but control of the facts itself can confer power. Discerning and reporting facts in a timely way is power. What we think of as the job of the news media is a powerful part of our democratic society. Without the facts, we can't make good informed decisions about our government that we need to make. Control of the facts, though, can be directed towards other goals other than the health of democracy. But facts don't always tell us what we need to know. They often need to be put into context and interpreted so that we know what to make of them. And that's when they become part of a narrative, a story with a meaning and a value. The spinners, the top tier of American journalists, is those who cover politics in D.C. and New York. It's where the weaving of the media narratives take place. The media elite have an easier time controlling the narrative, but everyone with a computer or phone can take part in spreading a compelling story. The mainstream media doesn't have the monopoly on what instead. We've talked about the revolving door before, and it happens outside of lobbying. It happens in the media as well. It's the tendency of a public official, journalist, and lobbyist to move between public and private sector jobs back and forth. Journalists take a position in government, then return to journalism again, and vice versa. It helps to have connections. All right, the role of the pundit. A pundit is a professional observer and commentator on politics. Traditionally, it's someone with a lot of wisdom. In contemporary media parlance, it's become to mean someone who is skilled in the ways of the media and politics, who can make trenchant observations and predictions about the political world, and really help us untangle the complicated implications of political events. We have this 24-hour news cycle now. which means we have a need for bodies to fill political panels. Some pundits are celebrity journalists who cross over from reporting on public figures to becoming public figures themselves. Because they receive a lot of media coverage, a pronouncement of a pundit carries a lot of power. So the media are among the main agents of political socialization. They help transfer political values from one generation to the next and help shape political views in general by the narratives they create about the meaning of politics. They're not worried so much about the media telling us what to think as we worry about the media telling us about what to think about and how to think about it. There are several types of media-related effects on our thinking. And these are first, agenda setting. The media's role in defining the relative importance to an issue or event via the amount and prominence of coverage they devote to it. When a TV reporter chooses to cover an event, they're telling us this is important and we should pay attention. Gives a reporter a lot of power. Framing. This is the process through which the media emphasizes the particular aspects of a news story, thereby influencing the public's perception of the story. Just as a painting can be altered by its frame, a political event can look different depending on how the media frames it. The third is persuasion by professional communicators. Some say the media affects public opinion because viewers who don't often have the time or background to research an issue themselves relies on opinion leaders. But often, especially with the internet and a 24-hour news cycle, the communicators on whom the media rely are often people who regularly pass through the revolving door, and maybe their objectivity can't be taken for granted. Fourth, the reduction of politics to sound and fury. Reporting on the details of policy wonks is hard. Diligence and toughness is required. But such hard work in a nonstop 24-hour news cycle sometimes means journalists don't have the ability or luxury to do the long-form piece or the deep dive into a story. They're under pressure to constantly produce something and that people are going to tune into. Horse race journalism. This is the media's focus on the competitive aspects of politics rather than the actual political proposals and political decisions. Viewing politics as a competition between individuals rather than the policy differences and the effects these decisions will make really increases the cynicism and trivializes what's at stake in campaigns and doesn't really educate the American public. Optics. These are the ways that a situation, a person, or event is presented by the media and perceived by the public. TV focuses on giving us a picture of politics instead of delving beneath the surface. So the focus becomes on optics, which leads us to value more superficial aspects of politics. A soundbite is the brief, snappy excerpt from a public figure's speech that's easy to repeat on the news. This is the audio equivalent of a snapshot. Our attention span's really been trained to have this instant and speedy gratification, so the reporters are looking for developing these simplified narratives. A feeding frenzy. This is an excessive press coverage of an embarrassing or scandalous subject. People are obsessed with catching politicians in a lie or a gaffe, so politicians are treated as fundamentally untrustworthy, though most do precisely what they say they're going to do. The effects of agenda setting and all of this shouldn't be taken to mean that we are unwilling dupes of the media. There are not ironclad rules, but tendencies that hold true for some people, but not all. We bring our own armor to the barrage of media effects that we face daily. We filter our own news watching through our own events, our own narratives and our own values. We have something called selective perception. This is the phenomenon of filtering incoming information through personal values and interests. If you don't seem to be well informed by the media, then the media may not be seen as playing a role or narrative in something going on in your life. This leads to cynicism about the media. About half or more of the American public think that the news is too biased, sensationalized, manipulated by their own special interests, and reporters offer too many of their own opinions and are negative. But if people cease to trust the media becomes less effective in playing their legitimate roles as well as their more controversial ones, and democracy becomes more difficult to sustain. So there's no doubt that the media portrays politics in a negative light, and the news reporting emphasizes personality, superficial image, conflict over substantive policy issues. And is this the media's fault or the responsibility of politicians and their own press officers who are so obsessed with their own images on TV that they limit access to the media? They speak only in the prearranged sound bites. They present carefully orchestrated media events. And their own efforts to control the political narrative, politicians are limiting the ability of journalists to do their jobs correctly. This is the permanent campaign. The idea that governing requires a continual effort to convince the public to sign on to the program, requiring a reliance on consultants and an emphasis on politics over policy. News management is the efforts of a politician's staff to control news about the politician. This is a chief mechanism of the permanent campaign. They want to put the politician in the best possible light. Spin is the interpretation of the politician's words or actions designed to present a favorable image. Most American politics has become a battle between the press and the politicians, and among the politicians themselves to control the agenda and the narratives that reach the public. For example, Nixon really tried to rehab his image after he lost to the media savvy JFK. JFK had this image as a war hero, a patriot, a devoted father, a faithful husband. All these were clearly not true, but they learned that the response is to the image, not the man, since most voters did not actually ever come in contact with the man. So Nixon was repackaged and sold as the new Nixon. He won election and re-election, and when he had to resign, it may have been the inevitable revelation of the real Nixon underneath. Some of the techniques that Nixon's handlers developed have become part of the basic repertoire of political staff today. They can include any or all of the following. Tight control of the information. Staffers kind of pick a line of the day and orchestrate all messages around that theme. Tight control of access to the politician. If the politician is available to the press for only a short amount of time, the press is forced to report that appearance as the only available news. A concerted effort to bypass the White House press corps. During Nixon, this meant going to regional papers that were a lot easier to manipulate. Today, this can mean going on a TV talk show, late night TV, and other forums that go directly to the public. This is part of this is rewarding media outlets that provide friendly coverage and punishing those who don't. Packaging the news in sound bites. If the media is only going to allow the public a brief snippet of political language, let the politician staff what it'll be. Press office will repeat a message often to be sure that the press and public will pick up on it. They'll make it catchy and memorable, and almost everyone now uses Twitter, so it can be posted there. And then fifth, leaks. Confidential information secretly revealed to the press. They can serve as what's called a trial balloon, an official leak or proposal to determine the public reaction without risk. If the reaction is negative, the official denies he ever mentioned it, and if it's positive, they can go ahead without risk. But since Nixon, not all political or presidential administrations are as equally accomplished at using these techniques. Reagan has been referred to as the model of public relations. Clinton didn't manage media effective early. By his second term, they were more adeptly handling scandals. George W. Bush did a good job of news management. He always received questions from only those who endorsed his programs and goals, and reporters who were trusted were favored. Obama wasn't quite as disciplined as George W. Bush, and then, of course, Trump did not begin on good footing with the press and made them a target during his campaign, which was maybe not his best idea. Politicians have to spend a lot of time and energy on image considerations that don't really help them serve the public, but the skills required by an actor and a statesman are not the same. Transformation of politics into professional storytelling means we suffer the loss of what's called political accountability, which is the democratic principle that leaders must answer to the public for their actions. This is the very hallmark of democracy. If our leaders do something we don't like, we can make them bear the consequences by voting them out of office. So almost from the beginning, control of the American media has been in the hands of an elite group, whether party leaders, politicians, wealthy entrepreneurs, corporate owners. Financial concerns mean mass media is driven more by profit than public interest. Ownership and control of the media are far removed from the hands of most Americans. There are citizen roles, like passive roles, like the reader, listener, watcher. The power they yield is that of switching papers or changing channels. But the rapid changes in information technology offers hope that the media can serve the public more effectively. Citizen journalism. This is reporting and commentary by everyday citizens unaffiliated with traditional media outlets, distributed via the web in the form of blogs or podcasts or video uploads. These new platforms are the modern-day equivalent of giving citizens their own printing press and the means to publish their views. But it's an unregulated source, so there's a lot of inaccurate and unsubstantiated information that's posted. There's no credentialing for a citizen reporter or a blogger, and they're not usually admitted to a White House briefing. They lack the resources to do the most investigative reporting. But they can do other things because they're not indebted to deep corporate pockets. They can hold mainstream media accountable. We still need to scrutinize the reporting of citizens as we do the rest of the media, and there's no substitute for a critical evaluation of the news. But citizen journalism provides a new kind of content that's really actually independent, that's actually open, that's more democratic in a way that traditional news media sources could never be. All right, guys, that's it for this semester. Please email me at my Gmail if you have any questions. I'm looking forward to reading all of your essays that are, don't forget, are due on April 25th. And your final exam will be posted, and it is due on May 2nd. Please email me with any questions, and thanks so much for a great semester.